Hello everyone, how you doing? Welcome to another video. This is a how-to video on how to set up local port forwarding on your home network. I'm going to take the opportunity to also explain how networks work overall, focusing on the home network, what you might have at your home, and how to open up the ports. So first things first, I'm going to do a primer on how the networks work, and then I'm going to explain the port forwarding part for things. But I'm going to put a link here on the video so you can just switch quickly to the end part if you already know how networks work. So how do networks work? Usually on a home network, you have something like this diagram that I just took from a random article online. You have the internet connecting to something of a router in it. We used to have a broadband modem. Then we ended up improving into a ASTL realms, and I have an ASTL router here that I'm going to show as well. So this one is ASTL. You can see it has an ASTL plug, and you have like a little box that comes from your ISP, brings the cable all the way to your house. It converts into this kind of signal, this kind of port, connects here, and then this machine will transform that signal into your local home network information. So the ISP knows the hardware that this has, like the specific MAC address, and will only serve internet to this specific one if you provide the correct login and password. So you have ADSL modems. You can also have internet by 3G, some sort of stuff. You put like a pen drive here and have the output of your internet here. You can connect to this to your PC or a switch locally. Another version here, a similar switch is by TP-Link. It connects here on the blue one, and then you have 4 ports and also some Wi-Fi automatically on the routers. Nowadays, most routers already come with Wi-Fi, which is very good. I have another one to show you, more sturdier one from Asus that I also have around, trying to get rid of it for sale. This one is actually dual band, so you can have like a public network for guests and stuff, and you can have a private network with more higher configuration speed, or higher speed configuration for your own private needs without it. Like if you have a lot of guests, you still have your basic internet working properly. So usually if you only have one machine at home, you connect it directly. If everything uses Wi-Fi, you just use the Wi-Fi from the router. It's a bit slow because you have a lot of packet losses. It's always better to have cable, especially if you have to pay attention to the speed of the cable outputs. Some routers used to only work with initially they only worked like with 10 and 100 megabits, and nowadays it's some of them are 1 gigabit. But in some routers, it's like the ports are limited. Only 1 or 2 of them has 100 megabits, 10 megabits. So you need to know which ones are the fast ones and which ones are the slow ones, so you can take advantage of that. And if the ports on the router are not enough, you will need what is called a switch. I have like a more professional one here that's usually used in companies, where you just connect a cable from the router into one of the ports of the switch. Doesn't matter which one. People usually use the first one, and then it will operate to relay the information between all the computers that are connected to the switch. So if you have 2 different computers here, both computers can see each other, and the internet that is connected on the first port. The switches usually don't have an address. They can be configured to have one, but usually they just ask the router which address to have. If you only have like a small home use, there are some smaller devices, some 4 or 6 port things. This one is like only 100, 100 a bit, so it's a very old one. I just had it here because it was a different one. Anyways, so how do these machines know of each other and where to send the packets of information? So the router has what it's called a DHCP server. You can it basically does, like, whenever it sees a new computer show up on the network, they communicate with the computer and says, hey, do you already have an IP? And he goes, no, I don't really have an IP. Can I have one, please? And the DHCP server gives him a new IP based on his MAC address. So the same computer, the same computer, as long as it has the same MAC address, and most network connections will maintain the MAC address, they will serve the same IP. So once you connect it, you will always get the same IP back, as long as the DHCP server is connected, is configured to maintain that information. Some are configured to, like, not care about the MAC address and just give whatever random new IP that is currently free. But anyways, that's usually how it works. They define a local network. Usually it's 192.168.0. It's like a postal code. You need to define the outer regions and the closer regions, and 192.168.0 is what is default used on local networks for use. Some routers will go crazy and use 192.168.1 instead of .0. They are really mad. But usually what happens is that the router will have the 192.168.0.1 IP for itself, and then it will give the other IPs to the other computers and reserve some for some stuff. Usually the 256 is also 255 actually is also reserved for some use. So usually when you want to access the router, it's usually 192.168.0.1 or 192.168.0.255. Depends on your local network. And I will show you how to access, how to know what local network you are currently having. So this is the scheme as I was mentioning. The internet connects to the broadband router, and the broadband router usually either connects directly to a computer or to a switch, which relays the information, but the router controls the DHCP, or the IP addresses that the whole network will have. So more items are connected to the switch will just send the information to the router. The router will say, okay, this is the IP for this computer, this is the IP for that computer, and they all communicate merrily between each other. The router controls all the information that comes inside and outside of the internet. I'm going to talk about firewalls later on as well, but for now we're going to stick with this, and let's try to figure out how we can know our IP. So if you go to, like, network settings, view network connections also works. You have, this is the Ethernet connection that is listed. If I had my Wi-Fi on, it would also be listed here. I don't have Wi-Fi on by default because I don't want to use Wi-Fi. I prefer to use cable. If you go to status, you can see the information, which just says you that it's working or not. If you click on details, you have the information on the IP that's used. So right now I'm using 192.168.0.13. So I know that my local network is 192.168.0. It even gives me the gateway here and the DHCP server, so I know that the router has this specific IP, and this is very important information. So now if I go to my browser and type 192.168.0.1, I will have the page of the router. And oh no, it has a username and password. How do I access that? So most routers that are installed come with the default password, and sometimes they even ask you not to change it because they want to access remotely, and this might influence it. Doesn't always influence it, I think. It depends on the operator, but sometimes it's needed that you don't change it. But you would supposedly want to change it, even though, like, you can only get compromised if someone comes into your local network, connects by cable, and tries to access this page. So if you only give your access to your local network to your friends, you're fine. You don't have to worry about it. Most people don't care about it. If you might have someone that comes into your home and connects and tries to change stuff and reconfigure your router stuff, then you will need to change this password to make sure they don't know it. And the reason you want to do that is if you just search for your operator and the default passwords that they have, you will find tons of sites with that information. Like, for example, Novo default router. Novo is my ISP right now. Default password. So if I didn't know the password, I do know it, but if I didn't, you'll find lots of websites here that are listing the different ones. I'm going to open this one in particular because I know it has a lot of useful information. So you can see for the different operators, for NOS, if it's a Netgear router, usually the username is MSO and the password is change me. If it's a ZonHub router, the username is usually home, the password is ZonNet. On and on and on, all the different providers that exist. This is just for Portugal alone. I'm sure you can find some for your local provider as well. And most of them are just user or admin. In my cases, I know it's admin, so I'm going to just use that. And it would be nice if I learned how to type. Yeah. And this panel might change depending to your operator and the router and the firmware that it has. You can also install some custom firmware on some specific routers. The one that I showed earlier, like the Asus, for example, I have the WRT installed here, which is just an open source version of the firmware that the router uses to configure. So as long as you know the ISP connections credentials, you can then go to the router and enter those, and you can still connect to your ISP, but using a router that you fully control and can fully configure to whatever benefit you want to have. So most of these panels have all these regular informations. You usually want to go to advanced when you want to configure port forwarding, and just find the item saying port forwarding, and you can create a rule for it. So what is port forwarding? Why would you be using it? It says here actually, so it's very useful to reach web servers, FTP servers, mail servers, etc. So sometimes sometimes your router might be, or your computer might be filtering out specific port activities. Like you have a program on your computer that's trying to access something using a non-default port, and there are some port numbers that are reserved for specific activities. Like HTTP is usually port 80, FTP server is usually port 21, mail server also has a specific port, and usually some of those are open, but then if you have like weird ports like 5431, it's usually closed by default, because there might be some services that have it open and then people could exploit them. So some routers try to crack down on that and limit the available ports, which is a bit stupid, since you can also explore the basic ports of HTTP and mail configuration just as easily. But well, that's pen security stuff, or pen testing security stuff. Doesn't really matter much for this video. Anyways, you might need to install port forwarding, and applications will just say, please put port forwarding working on our router, and you don't know how to do it. This is why you're watching this video. You go to your router page, you say what local port you want on your computer, and what port it will be showing on the outside machine, on the routers, and with the public IP. Usually you want to put the same port just because it's easy, but you can do other different ports as well. So you can use an external port, be like 5400, and but locally on your machine it's actually redirecting to port 6500 or something like that. So you have the local and end. It has a start and an end because it's a range of ports that you are opening and providing, and the protocol. TCP, UDP, or both. TCP is every single packet that you send is validated and confirmed and receives a confirmation that it's okay, and if it's not okay, it will send it back. UDP, it will just send packets, and you will never know if they arrived or not. Both of these protocols exist. TCP is mostly used, but UDP works pretty well for networks that don't have any packet loss. Usually you want to allow both because you don't know what your program is using. So just allow both by default, and you can turn it on, enabled here. And when you click apply, the router will update and will open those ports, and your program should be able to send the information outside. If it's still not able to do that, if it's still complaining, you can check your firewall settings as well and check your inbound rules and your outbound rules, and you can create new rules for things that you are either receiving from the internet or sending to the internet. And you can do a specific rule that allows specific ports. By default, when you run a program on Windows that is trying to access something on the internet, it will give you a pop-up saying, do you allow this? And if you click allow, it will automatically create a rule here that will allow this communication for these ports using this program specifically. If you click no by mistake, and this is the reason why you can't access the internet now, you will need to either find the rule here that is denying that specific port connection, going through the name of the application, or you can try to create a new rule that specifically allows for that specific port to work. For example, TCP ports, specific ports, like I want to allow 5000 to 5010. I'm going to use the example that it's down here. So this is the range of ports that will now be allowed. And then you can define the action. You are allowing the connection or you're blocking the connection. Yeah. So check firewall as well if the port forwarding is not working by default. That being said, some port forwarding stuff can be exploited, depends on how your program handles the port stuff. If the program you are running on your machine has basic admin access, and someone knows a vulnerability for it, they can use the communication thing to make your local program crash and give them access to your local computer. It's a long shot that someone does this, but there are vulnerabilities out there, and that's why ports are usually closed down by default. And you have no clue how these people are managing, how the programs are running the security on these connections. You don't know if it's encrypted. You don't know if there's a bug in the code that allows for remote user to access things in some way. So it's always good to limit as much as possible the number of ports that you're using, and know specifically what programs are using. Don't just install random software that is randomly connecting to somewhere on the internet. So yeah. There are other types of firewalls, which are physical firewalls that go between your local network, a local switch, and the router. Usually comes immediately after the router, is called firewall. And some routers have built-in firewalls as well. So you might have to check some configurations here on your router if it has some stuff like MAC filtering. This could be used as a firewall. For example, if you're denying access to every single computer with this particular MAC address, this is a form of firewall. IP filtering is another form of firewall. So, and it has a firewall here specifically for stuff. So be aware of that the firewall can be configured on the router itself, but it also can be a specific device just filtering every single traffic that passes through and checking if there is something that shouldn't be there and only allowing specific ports. And it has to be specifically configured. You will only find these kind of firewalls on not home network systems. Usually it's a company of some sort where they have crucial data on the local network, and they don't want anyone who comes and has access to the local network to have access to things. So they might even create two different networks, local networks, or what's called a VPN, where you have to log into a specific sub-network to be able to access that kind of information. But that's usually the role of a firewall, and a firewall can be also a hardware-specific thing that is in between. So if you're trying to configure port forwarding on a business environment or like a university, you're probably going to run into a hardware firewall that you have no way to access or configure, and it limits the number of ports that you can use. Usually what you use to bypass those is knowing the ports that it allows, like port 80 for HTTP is usually open, and you can port forward things through that specific port. But then you will need to be doing port forwarding not on the router but on the computer itself. Before your program sends, you'll be needing to send in your traffic. You usually can do this by what it's called a proxy, but you need to set it up locally, and it's extra configuration work. Usually programs just allow you to configure what port they will use. There's a configuration file on some form or some hack that someone did that allows you to change the default ports to something else. So look in the configuration of your program first before you start investing into setting up a proxy and stuff like that. Okay, so let me think, what other information was there left to mention? I talked about firewalls, I talked about port forwarding. I know I'm forgetting something, but I'm not sure what it is. Wireless, that's what I'm forgetting about. Usually most routers have Wi-Fi connectivity. You just need to know the password, and you can configure through the router configuration. You can change the Wi-Fi password as well. And usually what it happens is that if you're connecting via wireless, you can't access the router. It's a security thing so that anyone with a mobile phone can't access your router and try to change configuration stuff. So if you're trying to access this page 192.168.0.1 via either your laptop with Wi-Fi or your tablet, and you can't access it, that might be why you won't have access to the router unless you're directly connected with a cable. Most of routers have this rule enabled by default because it's Wi-Fi is very easy to crack, or used to be very easy to crack, so it's always a big security flaw. It's a lot easier to access someone's Wi-Fi than it is to access the physical network. To put like an Ethernet cable into the network, so they have that setting on by default. So that's also one of the issues, that you might not be accessing the routers page. So yeah, that's it. Can't think of anything else worth mentioning about port forwarding. Hope it was a bit clearer how you can configure it and the usual problems are behind it. Hope the whole overview of how the home Wi-Fi works was useful. And yeah, see you next video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. If you need a follow-up video explaining some of these things in more detail, very happy to do one of those. Just let me know in the comments. See you next video. Bye bye everyone. Take care. Enjoy your port forwarding days.